Are the actions that the church is taking right now making any difference in the social tension that is spreading across our country? I'll ask my friend Mike Palmer that very same question today. Mike is an African American pastor and former police officer, and I'm interested to see what he has to say. This is Real with Reed, a safe and honest conversation about faith from different perspectives. And episode 1 begins right now. Hi, Mike, and thanks for coming on. This is episode 1 of Real with Reed. That's pretty cool, huh?
It is cool. Episode 1.
Yeah. So, if we do lousy, then that's all there'll be is one episode. So, Mike Palmer is the campus pastor at our Eldersburg campus at Crossroads Community Church and has become a really good friend of mine. And so I wanted to have him on as our first guest for the podcast, and you'll see why in just a few minutes, as I feel like, Mike has been sort of placed at, what's the term, at a time, for a time such as this, such a time as this. And so I'm glad to be with you today, buddy.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me as your first guest.
Yeah. So describe to everyone, how did you end up at Crossroads Community Church? Because it's a rather unlikely story.
Right, it is. But God was in it the whole way. I was at the time I'd been pastoring 16 years, and I was pastoring my third church, and I decided, along with my wife and some guidance from my pastor at the time, who's passed along since then, that it was best for me and my family to leave. And it was the only time I'd left the church, and I didn't have another church to go to. And so I mentioned to a friend, Monica Gicking, who was a friend of yours at the time as well, and I didn't know that.
Yeah.
All I did was ask her for prayer. We were coming out of a meeting at the school, and I just said, "Hey, Monica, just keep us in prayer. I'm going to be resigning from my church." And her response, I'll never forget it. She says, "Well, how would you like to pastor closer to home?" Because I was still commuting from Owings Mills to DC at the time.
Yeah, right.
And she shared a little bit with me about how Crossroads was starting the Eldersburg campus. And of course, it was very attractive. But again, this was Monica just asking how I would feel about it. And, so I said, yeah, that'd be great. But what was on my mind was how to leave the church I was at the right way.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, she reached out to you. And after a little while, you reached out to me. And for a few months, you invited me to a number of events to just, and you even said it was about Crossroads, not just wanting me, but me and my family wanting Crossroads. And so
for sure, yeah,
we took some time to figure out if it was going to work. And we loved it. We fell in love with Crossroads. And so here we are.
And talk about the difference, right? So the church that you were at immediately before Crossroads, and then for 10 years before that, you were in predominantly Black churches.
Right.
And we are not I don't know what you'll call us eventually, but we're not a predominantly Black church. That's for sure. And so talk about how you thought about that transition. Even what did it cause you to pause and say, do I want to do that?
Oh, yeah, of course it did. Because it wasn't just me. I had to make sure that it was right for my family. And there would have been some pause probably anywhere. But yeah, coming from my last church, and all the churches were predominantly Black churches. But in addition to that major difference between that church and Crossroads was also the difference in that church was very traditional and very rules driven, where Crossroads is non denominational and very relational. And so, one of the first things I heard you say at an all leader launch in August of that year was that people were more important than programs. And I heard it, but as an experienced pastor, I said, okay, that sounds good, but I need to make sure that plays out. And as I spent more time with Crossroads, it became very obvious. And I said to my wife, you were actually living that out. And it was just nice to see it actually play out. So yeah, there were some major differences. And I'll tell you once, but it's a good church. And so Jesus was being preached. People were very relational. Um, the biggest adjustment we had to make was in the music. We were hearing songs that we hadn't heard before, or we'd hear
Hmm.
songs we heard, but they weren't uh, played or sang like we would hear them in the Black Baptist church. So it was a little different, but it was a good church though.
That's a fun story, and we'll get back to how it's been at Crossroads. But before becoming a pastor, I think it's really interesting, Mike, that you served in the military
Hmm.
and you served in the police department
Right.
for a number of years. Just give us a little bit of that backstory of the service and the police officer.
Yeah, so I joined the service on a day that will always be marked in history because it was January 28th, 1986. That was the day
My
unfortunately we
birthday.
lost. Is that your birthday?
Yeah, man. Oh, I
January
thought
20th?
that's what you were going to say.
No,
That's
no,
why.
no. I didn't look, I was talking about the
I
the
know the
space
space
shuttle. Yeah.
shuttle. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay.
So, interestingly enough, I had just done everything that being from San Francisco, they came and got me in the early in the morning and went over to Oakland to the what's called the MEP station where you do all your processing, paperwork, physical, and all of that. And all I was waiting for was to be sworn in, and I'm sitting in front of this big screen TV, and I watched that happen. And so I always
Wow.
remember where I was when that event took place. But yeah, joined in '86, and I was actually a military police officer. I was in the Army. I was in Germany, Korea, and then I ended up on the East Coast. So that's how I got from the West Coast to the East Coast. I ended up in Virginia when I came from Korea,
Hmm.
and I just stayed. I was an MP, and so because I was a military police officer, I was looking for a police department to join when I got out. And my plan, and this is where let me say this: I wasn't saved at the time, so I had my plan, and I didn't know the whole "your ways are not my ways." So, I didn't know any of that, but when I look back, it certainly
Yeah.
applies. So my plan was to find a local department. I was in Northern Virginia, so that meant Fairfax, Arlington, maybe even Metro. So I was looking at those departments and thought, I'll stay on the East Coast for a few years. My grandparents were in Georgia, hadn't been able to spend a lot of time with them, so I was able to travel and see them. And then I'd head back home to the West Coast. And, that didn't happen.
How many years ago was that?
That was 92.
Yeah. So here you are,
Yeah.
still on the
Yep.
East Coast.
Yep.
But one of the turning points there, correct me if I'm wrong, was that you had an encounter with the Lord in the midst of after you became an officer, and so talk about that. Talk about the beginning of your faith journey, which probably for many people started long before yours did.
Yeah. So let me go back to I was transitioning out of the army and I decided to go to a job fair. And again, I had my resumes ready, looking for the police departments, and I saw a booth, and it was the nicest booth in the job fair, and Roanoke, Virginia. I never heard of Roanoke, and I was not going because I was a big city person, and I wanted a big city department. And the guy reminded me of one of my uncles, called me over, and we started talking. Older black gentleman, and I gave him my resume, and that's I ended up at the Roanoke City Police Department. And interestingly enough, some years later, I ended up being baptized a couple months before my 30th birthday. I got involved in a church through one of my buddies who was a cop, getting married at this particular church. His mother-in-law invited all of us to come back. As I say, I took the bait and ended up sitting with them, and I understood what Pastor Keaton was saying, and it just made sense to
Mm,
me. It was unlike anything I expected. I didn't expect to understand anything,
mm.
but he preached very simple sermons that were easy to understand, very challenging, and I ended up joining the church, got called into ministry, started going to seminary at Virginia Union, and one day, and this is a really interesting story, my pastor was preaching in an afternoon service on the other side of Roanoke. So I go over with him and we walk in together and he says, "Hey, come on back. Let me introduce you to the pastor." And we go in the back and the pastor is none other than the guy who was at the job fair
Oh,
some
you're
years
kidding.
ago. Yeah, he was the human resources guy. I knew him as Mr. Beatty, but I didn't realize he was a pastor.
Oh,
And
that's great.
that's the guy who had gotten my attention at the job fair. And I still didn't realize it then, but now I know without a doubt, that God was all over this thing,
That
and I
he
was like,
had you. You
whoa,
didn't
this
even
year.
know it yet.
Yeah. Yep. So,
That's great.
so yeah, that's how things kind of happen. And, you look back and see God, and, he was all over it every step
Yeah.
of the way.
Yeah. And so you come to faith at middle, not middle age, maybe 33 or something like that. Is that about right?
Yeah, I was 30 years old when I came to Christ.
Yeah.
I was, a couple months before my 30th birthday.
And so you begin this faith journey, but I'm assuming that immediately it was also connected with a bunch of racial implications because you went to a predominantly Black church at
Hmm.
that time.
Right.
And so, in your mind, what was the connection between faith and race at that point?
Oh, there was absolutely no disconnect. I mean, when you have, there's a church, it's predominantly Black church, um, uh, which is filled with people who are dealing with issues of race every day of their lives. And
Yeah,
so certainly when issues come up that are happening outside the church, but maybe in the city or in the country, in the state, anywhere,
yeah,
uh, we there was an expectancy that we were going to hear about it. That if it wasn't the sermon, it would be some form of communication or conversation about that particular event. Always, encouraged to pray about it, but what kind of action can be taken as well. So yeah, there was, and it's not like it was an everyday thing. And what I mean by it is, as a Black person, you were dealing with racial issues, and so
hmm.
there was no shying away from them in the church, not in the Black church
How
anyway.
could you, right?
Right, exactly.
It was a part of your life, and if Jesus is supposed to transform all of your life, then it's all of your life,
Right, that's right.
and that was a big part of it. At what did you come into the church? What kind of racial um, either unity or division experiences from your time in the military and your time as a police officer? What was your posture going into now this new walk of faith in terms of racial diversity or racial unity?
You mean when I first came to the Lord, when I first got into ministry? At
Yeah,
what point?
yeah. And when you first came to the Lord and you were still working as a police officer, talk about how race was a part of uh, your world at that point.
Well, again, it was evident. I mean, it was there, not so much because I was a police officer or because I was in church. It was there because I was Black, because I'm a Black man, and so there are things that you deal with. But when I got into the church, when I came, gave my life to Christ, the dilemma I had was, how do I handle it differently now as a Christian, as
Yeah.
opposed to how I would have handled it before? Not that I was doing anything bad, but is there something different, anything more, anything less I should be doing? And then how much more responsibility is now on me or anybody as a child of God
Mhm.
to respond, to help others through certain issues dealing with race. So yeah, it became a big concern, and it wasn't anything I talked about every day because there was nothing happening every single day. But
Mhm.
certainly when things happen, okay, now I have to respond, but how do I do that? And set the right example for other Christians or non-Christians who
Yeah.
are looking for a Christian to do the right thing.
What a great, I mean, that is a synopsis, isn't it, of a point that's so important to say when you said, okay, so now how should I approach this because of my faith?
Right.
That it's not that without faith you can't do anything that's good or anything like that. We're not or right. We're not saying that, but we are saying that your faith should make a difference in every area of your life, and this one should be no different. That it should make a big difference. in your life. And so, if you weren't keeping track along the way here, Mike has served as a police officer, has served as a pastor in the Black church, and in our world, as we're filming this right now, over the past 3 weeks after the death of George Floyd, it has come to the surface that these issues are far from resolved in our world, and so I ask you now, Mike, after years of ministry and after your perspective on this, what's the response of the church as we talk about issues of race and justice and race and faith? What's the role that the church can play, should play, could play?
Well, so I've gotten questions like that about the church, and one even like this morning about the church's role. What's the church going to do? And I gave that some thought. And one of the things I would love for people to encourage people to think about is this: when we talk about the church, we would love to be talking about one church,
Mm,
but we know we have white churches, we have Black churches, and so when we think about it, you know, the Black church has been dealing with the things and responding to these things all the time. Most Black churches, anyway. I won't speak for everybody, but
mhm,
typically the Black church is going to speak into some current events. And so the question, might be, how does that play out for the white church? Because there's some actions that that the white church can take and get involved in, um, and help to change things and move things further along than they already are. And so, yeah, the church has a responsibility as the church.
mm,
But to be more specific, there is a different responsibility on the white church than there is on the Black church now, and I don't know if I'll say different, because praying and there are some common things that we are responsible for. But outside the church, when you leave the sanctuary,
mm.
or the prayer meeting, what are you doing as a white person to make life better for a Black person? What kinds of changes are you encouraging or challenging others to make, um, to help make things better for people like me?
Yeah, and so that boils it down in a really profound way to say, how do we as the church begin to step into those roles? Where have you seen it done well, Mike, or have you seen it done well? Have you seen a place where, when you were talking, the verse that came to my mind was Jesus' prayer in John 17, right, where he says, "God, make them one."
Hmm.
And I don't see a lot of oneness, but every now and then I get a glimpse of some people who have figured that out, or at least are moving in that direction. Look more unified than our culture, but boy, that would be our hope, right? Is that when the culture looks at the body of Christ, that we would be at least a little farther along in terms of unity on this issue than the culture is, that we would lead the way in some way.
You would
So,
think so,
yeah, you would hope so. Well, I would pray so.
right?
And so, are we making any progress anywhere? Where have you? Is there any place that you would look and say, we are making in progress here?
Um, well, I would say, as far as progress goes, I the think it's one of those, for lack of a better term, the best is yet to come or not, because the current events we're in are
Mm,
really, this is really the time when we will see, because nobody can look past this. I don't know how people look past other things that have happened, but this one is so big, with
mm,
George Floyd, and then it's actually opening people's eyes to other things that were happening leading up to that. And
mhm,
so, as a church, I think the answer to that question is, maybe it hasn't been answered yet, but I just hope that we will even, think about how far we've come, and maybe, instead of answering that, how far can we go in our
mm,
current situation? And I thought about this too, Reed. I was because I got an email from somebody, and it was a nice email, and but several people have asked about the church. You mentioned it, and what is the church going to do? And sometimes the tone sounds like people are waiting for the church. And one of my responses was, the church does have a responsibility. The church has a role to play. We are to
Sure.
do something as the church. But if you're waiting for your church, you're missing it, because
Mm,
you don't need to wait for your church as an individual to get involved. And sometimes people will use the church as an excuse not to act because the
mm,
church didn't do anything. But if you are a member of the church, then you also have a personal responsibility or an individual responsibility to maybe encourage, even if it's just a small group. But I would say that, don't, encourage your church. The church has a responsibility. I don't want to take that away. But at the same time, you don't have to wait for your church, and please don't use the church as a way out.
mm. That's really interesting. So, and I know you and I have talked and prayed about the response as leaders of our church, what we would do. And the point that you just made is there are multiple levels of response, but it can't skip the individual level,
Right.
right? I mean, it doesn't get the church leadership or the body of Christ as a whole off the hook.
Hmm.
Far from it. But it also doesn't get the individual off the hook, and that's where it has to start, right? And with some introspection, you and I have talked about this idea of humbling yourself and understanding a little bit more of where I am individually. That if we all started to grow in that way, in our understanding of ourselves and the concept of where am I missing it in terms of my attitudes and actions.
Hmm.
You don't have to wait for anybody to do that. That's a great,
Right.
great point that I hope we can get across to people. But there is a bigger, broader, maybe is a better term, church responsibility, right? That you just began to talk about. So as a leader, you've been a leader in a predominantly black church, and now you're a leader in a predominantly white church.
Hmm.
Um, what's the picture that we need to present as leaders of all churches on a broader scale here? What could you imagine God would do if we were able to move towards one another and not away from one another because of what's happening right now?
Well, I'll tell you, big picture. Um, I would love for us as a church, as leaders of any church, to uh, be courageous.
Mm,
Um, because when we look at the Bible and we talk about Jesus, Jesus made sacrifices. He would he went places and he talked to people that others didn't think he should go or talk to. And
mhm.
one of the things, I still watch quite a bit of Sports Center, even though there's not much going on right now. And I heard one of the guys, they were talking about everybody speaking out now and a lot of athletes.
Yeah.
And I heard one of the guys, he said something that stuck with me, Reed. He said, I appreciate, it was like the white quarterbacks or who they were talking about. And he said, I appreciate these guys speaking out, appreciate their support. He said, but the only pushback he had was, where was the support when the sacrifice needed to be made? He said, a
Mm,
lot of people are speaking out now that it's safe to speak out. And I say that to say, I wish the church would not wait for the safe space to say
mm,
anything. But when something happens, don't worry about who may or may not like it. Speak truth and the gospel into that situation. But sometimes, and I say we as a church, and I'm not talking just about pastors either, but as a
yeah.
church, we kind of shy away and we may, we may do a little bit that kind of skirts the issue. But I wish we would uh, just be courageous, and even risk the persecution that we are told we were going to feel if we're followers of Jesus anyway.
Sure.
Uh,
Right.
but don't wait for the safe space.
Mm,
Take full advantage of the moment
mm.
and do what's right.
Yeah. Well, gosh, what a great charge for the church to not wait for the safe space. You imagine if Jesus waited for the safe
Oh
space,
man.
right? and, and I think that's just so compelling, Mike. A couple more questions here.
Sure.
You know that um, I have a particular interest in figuring out what actions make a difference and what actions don't make a difference. Because I feel like those two things are confused often when it comes to the issue of race and justice in particular,
Mhm.
where people who may want to do something end up doing something that doesn't make any difference, and they check the box
Yep.
and they think, there, I did something. And where maybe it's more public or more obvious. And sometimes the things that make a difference aren't public and don't get seen. And it's either a commitment to prayer or a relationship that you're building or something like that. So when you say be courageous, gosh, part of me thinks being courageous is doing the things that matter, even if nobody sees them. And that's not a question. I should make it a question. But what do you think is helpful? If people are listening right now and they're thinking, oh gosh, I never even thought about it. What could be helpful as a Christ follower in terms of actions that would actually make a difference?
I would say first, take a breath. Just and think about what it is you can do, whether it's physical ability or resources.
Hmm.
Because I think well, not think, but I know oftentimes we have these knee jerk reactions, and what ends up happening is we are just checking off the box, and then we think, like you said, that whatever the action is, it has to be a very public and a very visible action when there are phone calls to make, some one-on-ones that can be had. And I talked to you about some one-on-ones and some group of conversations I had that a lot of people don't know about,
Hmm.
related to the George Floyd uh, killing. And so, um, you know, I say take a breath, take a look at who you are and who you have around you, whether in your family and on your team or in your community. Um, and then think about, okay, God, and pray about what is it that I can do or what is it that we can do, because there's something specific that every one of us can do to contribute
Hmm.
to causing change. And sometimes we're doing things that are not necessarily within the purpose that God has given us. And there's nothing wrong. I applaud people like that who want to get out there and do something.
Of
But
course.
with our situation, even in something we're talking about doing, it was about just taking a minute, figuring out who we are, who I am, where I am, and then asking God what's best for me and my purpose and my situation right now.
Mm.
Yep.
Two things that you said there, maybe um, tuck underneath the main point, are important. I think for everyone. Me, starting with me, is as long as you think that the problem starts out there somewhere, we've missed the first step of introspection, right? And so sometimes the taking of the breath is to say, okay, let me come from a posture of humility and not a posture of superiority or something like that. And I would implore people to start with an introspective look to say we're all a work in progress, me especially, and if it doesn't start from there, more than likely it will limit how far we can go or the impact that our actions will have. And the second one, Mike, I don't know if I've shared this with you before or not, but one of my pet peeves is when people hear about a need, let's say any need, and they don't listen to what's actually needed. They see something, maybe it's an under resourced family or it's a crisis situation like we're facing right now. And instead of stopping and listening to what actually could be helpful, we just do what we think would be helpful without ever listening to the people say, well, no, that don't do that. And I think that's just the reverse of the gospel, because what the gospel is God did exactly what we needed at all of his cost, and so the fact that I would listen and then do whatever is necessary at whatever cost to me, that's the gospel response.
Yep.
And so few people ever take that posture, the church included, that we'll just do stuff that makes us feel better about us.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to, in your response, I was feeling both of those things. Like, A, start with me, but B, then listen.
Mm-hmm.
Listen before you act, so that you make sure that your actions are actually helpful in some way.
And let me say, Reed, let me go back, because I was listening to myself and thought it could sound like, I want to make sure nobody misinterprets what I'm saying about taking a beat and just thinking about it. Sometimes, thinking about it requires you to take some action at the same time. And so I don't want it to sound like I'm saying, hey, don't go out, don't do anything. Just sit still. And some people need that, some people don't. But it's you just have to evaluate yourself in every single situation. And you might be inclined to go, right out and get something done because for sure this is what I need to do. But there may be other times when you just need to sit back and just kind of check your stuff for a minute, and we all have some stuff. So, and just see how I'm feeling. I know, with the George Floyd stuff, and I'll bring this into play just a little bit. I think it's relevant. I was getting a lot of calls and, from people in the church and outside the church. But one of the things I had to do, and I talked to you about shutting down one day, because I had to deal with my own stuff. I was angry, I was sad, and here I am still trying to pastor people in the middle of that. And so I really had to shut down so that I can get Mike together. And I had to be selfish in that way and just kind of let everybody else wait for a minute, because it's not just me, it's me and my family. And so, that's the beat sometimes I'm talking about as well. And just, take care of yourself for a minute. Because for me not to do that could have taken me down a path I didn't want to go, and a path God didn't want me to go down.
Yeah. Wise words of wisdom right there from Dr. Mike. Wait, and you said people might misunderstand what we're saying right now? That can never happen, right?
Oh man, never.
Okay, good.
Never.
I got a little worried there for a minute. Hey, Mike, one of the things that I want to do in every Real with Reed podcast is allow the folks who I'm interviewing to ask me a few questions. So let's turn it around for a second, and you can ask me anything you want, and I'll try to do as good as you've done in giving some helpful responses.
Well, and I think I only have one, unless it leads us somewhere else.
Sure.
I was going to ask, so we talked about the church and race and, responses. So being the pastor of a predominantly white church, and I say predominantly white, and I want to add who is a church that is intentionally making strides to become more multicultural and multi-relational. How do you anticipate any, how do you anticipate the church will respond, or do you think you'll run into any issues? Because race is a very sensitive topic, and it is a predominantly white church in a predominantly white county.
For sure. Yeah. A great question. And I'm sure that there are blind spots that I have in terms of leading through this will undoubtedly uncover some minds that I'll step on that I didn't know were there. I see a bunch of them already that are there, and but it doesn't dissuade me from wanting to lead through it. I do feel, and I've told you this, that God brought you to our church for a time such as this, that there was a bigger picture involved when God brought you to our staff. And so I'm jazzed about leading I think leaders do get fired up when the stakes go up, and so that's how I'm feeling. I have no doubt that we are going to make people angry. Some people angry, some people happy, some people scared, some people. But that's kind of not the point, right? The point is to listen to where God's calling us to lead, and then lead with courage.
Yep.
Lead with all diligence, so that we don't have a conservative or a liberal response, or we don't have a black or a white response, or we don't have an upper class or a middle class response. That we have a Christ follower response,
Mhm.
you know, and to be able to model for people what that might look like, that it doesn't fit into any of the paradigms that they're used to hearing about when it comes to the issue of race and justice. That makes me excited. I've asked people to pray that we'll do it well, as we start on this journey together. But I do think that uh, the pattern just can't keep being repeated. Well, I guess it can be. It has been repeated, and there's big hoopla, and then there's life as normal. And
Right.
I'm just hoping that that's the end of that cycle, and as best we can, to be in it for the long haul. I want to lead with you and the rest of our staff in a way that really does lead into a new place.
I appreciate that.
So
That was
that's
all
a
I had.
that's a big task,
It is.
and I'm certain that there are other pastors who are thinking and praying the same thing, and we're going to try to link up with them
Mhm.
as well. But for now, thanks, Mike. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for being real. You always are, and we're going to hope that this conversation really helps some people, and we'll keep leading. Thanks,
All right.
brother.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. Thanks for having me on as the number one guest, the first.
Thanks. Take care.
Discussions like this are absolutely necessary, and we're so excited to offer a safe place to share perspectives and grow together. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on today's discussion in the comments below. I'm Reed Robinette. I can't wait to continue the conversation.